All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Utah Story Show. We have a very exciting program today. It's about 3 years in the making. I've been wanting to talk to a person who restores wild habitats of wetlands and talk about the advantages of it. I saw for my first time a wildlife restoration project, a wetland restoration project, about 4 years ago in Boulder, Utah, at the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch, and I was totally blown away. And I'm going to show you a clip of what they've done there. We're going to talk about it, how it makes such a significant impact on especially landscapes in the West, especially ranches that have been depleted of soil, of the minerals and nutrients that make the pastures flourish and attract the wildlife. And we're going to go all into that. It's going to be great. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about one of our new sponsors. It is jet skis from Action Toy Rental. So this summer you can rent 2 jet skis for as low as $277 per day at any lake in Utah. They'll deliver it for you. It is super easy. You can pull a tube, a wakeboard, or water skis, and they just do a fantastic job. They have 5-star reviews. We're about to use them next week. I'll tell you even more about how they're doing. But they are offering a special discount for anybody, especially who will use their jet skis or their boats during the week. If you use offer code UT2020, you'll save at least $40. But if you're going to do it over the weekend, don't wait until the last minute. Book now at actiontoyrental.com. And you remember to use that offer code UT2020. You'll have a ton of fun. I guarantee you. I've been on these things before. They're incredibly powerful. They're no hassle. If you got a few kids, you can have them on the back. You can have a wakeboard. You can have a tube. You're going to have a ton of fun. And it starts as low as $277 per day. So go book your jet skis right now. Okay. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about Tom Biebighauser. He's been restoring wetlands and streams for 40 years. He's designed 6,000 wetland restoration projects all over the world, really. He started getting involved in this Boulder Mountain project a few years ago. But Tom, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks for inviting me. We're talking about my favorite subject, wetlands. And I talk to many people about wetlands in my travels, and I find out that folks don't always know what a wetland is. So I describe them as areas of shallow water that have aquatic plants growing in them, and they're full of wildlife. If you want to see wildlife, go to a wetland area.
Yeah. Well, when I go up to the mountains with my dogs, we're always looking for the springs. And if we just hang out by a spring and be quiet, we notice all sorts of birds come by. There's like a lot of insects. There's always different sorts of wildflowers. And so obviously the ecological benefits are huge. But let's go back and talk about why was it that, at least the perception is that in the initial founding of the West and the Western United States, wasn't draining wetlands and swamps just a huge part of what homesteaders were doing?
We're finding out that it was something that many of the homesteaders were doing, was draining wetland. Now, when people first started crossing the mountains, when Europeans were crossing the mountains and starting to homestead, they saw a landscape quite a bit different than what we see today. The valleys and the drainages were full of beaver ponds. In fact, there's many writings about this, that in attempting to cross these valleys, they would go through wet meadows with saturated soils. They would encounter shallow water, and that shallow water would be teeming with ducks and geese. And we had water all over the landscape in our valleys. But now, when you fly over many parts of the West, including Utah, it's uncommon that you see water. In fact, you're lucky to see a reservoir. You know, what happened to all this shallow water or wetlands on the landscape? And we're just beginning to uncover the history of drainage throughout the West and why it was done.
So why was it done?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. Uh, First of all, we know that when you have livestock, to overwinter, one needs hay and plenty of hay. And where are you going to grow your hay? Well, you're going to grow your hay where you have water. And years ago, we didn't have all the irrigation setups that are available today. So people would grow their hay where the soils were saturated, and this was typically in a type of wetland we call a wet meadow. And these wet meadows were supplied with water primarily from springs. And what's really interesting when you go into a wet meadow is you see everything is green. And the plants growing in a wet meadow include many of our sedges and our bulrushes, and they stay green all year, even through the winter. And we have found that they're very high in nitrogen, they're very nutritious, and they're very productive. And what the early settlers would find is that the livestock, the horses, the cows, would feed in these wet meadow areas. And many of the wet meadow areas have been made by beaver. What had happened is that beaver had built a dam in the valley and they had flooded part of the valley, but then for some reason the beaver moved on. Maybe they had been killed by predators, and then the dam no longer continued to hold water. So then we have a wet meadow forming. And wet meadows are just fascinating because they're full of wildflowers and all these sedges and rushes. Well, another thing that happened, which was unfortunate, is that if you were trying to graze livestock in a wet meadow, many times they would get stuck in the saturated soils, the mud, and they would perish because they couldn't get out. And I've heard many stories from elderly ranchers who tell me about cows getting stuck in the mud near springs and these wet meadows, and how much work it was to pull a cow out of that mud. So many of our wetlands in the West were drained because they were actually traps for livestock. And there were so many more animals on the land grazing that you couldn't afford to lose even one.
Mm-hmm.
But another reason that many of our wetlands were drained was to move water to a reservoir. Many ranchers learned that if they built a dam, a pond, or a tank, that they could collect water and then they could use this water to irrigate their hay fields and their crop fields. So they would build these dams and then they would find that their reservoirs wouldn't fill. Now, what they would do then is that they would often go up the valley and find these natural wetlands and wet meadows and then dig ditches to direct that water into the reservoirs and thereby filling the reservoirs. And this would overcome the leaking under the dams and the reservoirs. And another reason they would dig ditches is for irrigation. If you could drain part of a wetland and move that water where your crop fields are, then you would do quite well with farming and raising hay. So what we find is that many of the hay fields across the West were made by draining wetlands. And what would happen when you dig a ditch is that you eliminate standing water, and then also you lower the elevation of water in the ground. And then you can end up farming that area, raising crops on it and raising hay on it, and your livestock won't get stuck in the mud when they're grazing.
Mm-hmm.
So we're finding that most of our springs across the West, the flow from those springs was diverted into ditches so that the wet meadows wouldn't be too wet to cut for hay.
And I heard a crazy statistic, and you could probably verify it for me, that in Utah, there were 40% of the area of Utah was swamps and wetlands and soggy soil. Is that true?
Well, I have studied drainage all my life, and I've been involved in many drainage projects. And I find out that we underestimate how wetlands have been drained, the number of wetlands that have been drained on the landscape. And in the research that I've done of Utah, I have found out that over 40% of the natural wetlands in Utah were drained. And
Yeah.
they were drained for so many different reasons. Many times the water was diverted into these plumes for mining. Many times it was diverted into reservoirs so that it could be used for drinking and the water could be used for irrigation. And the real key to identifying a drained wetland is to look for a ditch. People dig ditches because they want to move water, because they want to remove water. So if you find a ditch on the landscape, whether it's an irrigation ditch or whether it's a drainage ditch, that ditch is still moving water. So one of the first things I look for is a ditch when identifying a place to build or to restore a wetland.
Mm-hmm.
And many people say, well, let the beaver do the work. I mean, after all, that's what beaver do, is they build dams. And I agree. If you have a stream that's flowing in a ditch, eventually beaver are likely to move in and attempt to build a dam on that stream and partially restore a wetland. But we find that many of the wetlands that were drained by diverting water from springs, a beaver isn't capable of building a dam on these sites. And the reason is that much of the flow is below the surface. And a beaver is able to build a dam on more level ground where water is flowing over the surface. But when that water is flowing below the surface, the beaver doesn't have the technology to store that water and to restore a wetland. Mm-hmm. Whereas we have developed the techniques where we can go out there now, find a ditch that was used to divert water from a spring, and go through a process where we can restore the landscape and the wetland, and then see all these wildlife species come back that were once common in the area.
Yeah, and I want to show our viewers, hopefully our listeners can go check this out too, but I want to show our viewers an example of what I'm talking about and you're talking about. So we're going to take a trip to Boulder, Utah, and I want to show you, first of all, the landscape, an overview of what it looks like. It's extremely arid. If you've ever been out there, it's just desert. This is a view with my drone I took in 2017.
So we're going to the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch, owned by Ron Johnson and Brandy Hardman. Mm-hmm. Great conservationists, really outstanding leaders in their field. And we find that Sweetwater Creek flows on the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch, and beaver have built dams along Sweetwater Creek.
So this is the creek we're looking at now, and that's my dog Joey. And the creek is not very big, but the wild plants that you see along the creek edge just go up the banks and all the way up the mountains, which I found really amazing, because you wouldn't think with that little water that's flowing, it would make such a significant impact on the entire pasture and everything that's around it. So walk us through, how did it go from basically being what we saw as that overview, just pure desert land, to being this amazing oasis with all these thick wildflowers and thick pasture fields and grasses? How does that happen in 15, 20 years?
Well, let's go back to 2016 when Craig Sponholtz, who runs the company called Watershed Artisans, mm-hmm. he was working for a number of years with Ron Johnson and Brandy Hardman at the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch, and he recognized that there could be opportunities to restore wetlands. So they invited me to come out to the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch, and I stayed there, and we wandered around the ranch looking for signs of wetland drainage. And we all marveled at the beauty of the beaver ponds along Sweetwater Creek. But then we went to higher ground, and we found evidence of springs flowing out from the base of the mountain. And these springs were really unique. They were beautiful, with all the rock formations and all the unique plants growing in the saturated soils. But the water just disappeared. We thought, well, springs generally form streams, and the only stream is Sweetwater Creek at a much lower elevation. So what was happening to that water on higher elevations? Well, we did some searching. We found that ditches had been dug to take the water from the spring and move it off of the ranch in a hurry. And these ditches had been dug right at the base of the mountain, right near the Dixie National Forest. And these ditches were quite deep, and they were completely covered with vegetation. In fact, most people who visit the ranch had no idea that ditches have been dug to dry the wet meadows that were supplied with water from the springs.
Hmm.
So what we did is we mapped the ditch locations. We took elevations on their slope. We measured their width, their depth, but we had a tough time measuring how much water was flowing in these ditches because of the dense vegetation. And then I worked with Craig Sponholz to design a wetland restoration project, prepared a detailed report outlining what could be done to restore the wetlands, to return the historic elevation of groundwater, and to bring back habitat for a diversity of wildlife species. What we were hoping to do was to provide habitat for the bald eagle, for the bluehead sucker. We wanted to help the boreal toad. We wanted to provide habitat for the Columbia spotted frog. We were interested in helping the Colorado River cutthroat trout and also the lowland leopard frog. We thought, can we do this in the middle of the desert? So we did quite a bit of soil sampling. We dug core samples to identify soils that were high in clay, and we looked at the elevation of water in the ground, and we came up with a detailed plan for restoring these wetlands. And
Why
Randy,
does the
Ron,
why does the
go ahead,
clay
please.
content important? I watched one of your other
Well,
videos
think
and
about in the morning when you fill your cereal bowl with milk and how it doesn't leak all over the place. Well, that's the main reason that wetlands hold water, is that there's a natural bowl or there's a natural, what we call aquitard of clay in the basin.
hmm
And when you dig a ditch, you often cut through that clay and you drain the wetland area. So we were able to use the ribbon test where we measure clay content by hand, and we were able to determine there was enough clay on site and there was enough water in the ground. And I have developed techniques for blocking ditches, which sound really simple. You think, well, all you have to do with the ditch is fill it with soil. Well, that doesn't work all the way. What we find is that when you look at a ditch, the water flowing in the ditch that you can see is maybe 1/3 of the water. 2/3 of the water is flowing underground in the ditch and you can't see it. It's just like a stream. When you look at a stream flowing, I would say over 2/3 of the water is flowing beneath the surface of the water in the ground. So we came up with these techniques for disabling the ditches, restoring the wetland basins. And in 2018, I returned to the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch and we began a wetland restoration program where we restored 11 wetlands of different sizes and depths. And we restored these to provide habitat for everything from the bald eagle to the leopard frog to the cutthroat trout. So
very cool.
when you look at the area now, it really is a paradise. It truly is the oasis in the desert, and it gives us a snapshot of what many of the ranches look like prior to historic drainage.
So what you see there in that clip I showed, that's really what it looked like before it was drained, really? That whole
It's very
area?
similar. Yes, it takes years for the plants to colonize, but it gives you a good idea of what it looked like and why the original rancher probably moved that water.
hmm
Something when people dig a ditch, the ground is too wet, they want to dry it out. But when you dig a ditch, you unleash erosion that can last and accelerate for hundreds of years. So when people dig a ditch, what they didn't know is that they start the formation of waterfalls or head cuts. And these erosional features that we call head cuts cause a deepening and a widening of the ditch. And many of the canyons, in fact, all the canyons we see in the West were formed by erosion associated with head cuts. In fact, when you look at the Grand Canyon, that was formed by head cuts, but those head cuts were natural. So many times when I'm on a ranch in the West and I find a canyon, we can trace it to somebody digging a shallow ditch to dry a wet meadow, or maybe somebody was running livestock up and down the wet meadow, and those livestock scored a trail in the ground. And when the infrequent rain came, this caused erosion and head cuts to form and eventually canyons. I found a canyon once that was formed because in the 1800s, somebody took a cart pulled behind an ox and they moved it up the drainage. And then what happened is that the water started flowing in the tracks of that cart, formed head cuts, and eventually a canyon with walls that were 13-foot vertical.
Wow.
So we took action at the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch to control the head cuts that were still active. We buried rock in the ground. We didn't place the rock on the surface, but we buried this rock in the ground to form what we call vertical grade control structures, basically underground speed bumps that stop erosion. And this way we could reshape the wetland basins and we could block the ditches, both the water flowing in the ditch as well as underneath the ditch. And then we could control the head cuts and restore a wetland habitat that would require little, if any, maintenance. You know, when most people build a ranch pond, they build a dam. And I've built over 1,400 dams in my career. I no longer build dams. I find we don't need to build a dam to build a pond or a wetland. If you build a dam, you have to maintain it. Animals will burrow into the dam like muskrats and beaver. Water can flow over the dam during a flood, and water can flow under the dam. So if you look at a natural wetland, it doesn't have a high dam. The dam on a natural wetland may be 6 inches high. So when I restore wetlands now, I build them so they don't have dams and you won't have maintenance. And I build them so they will capture that infrequent rain and capture the groundwater and not lose it. This is why you don't have to divert thousands of acres of watershed into a wetland to get it to hold water.
Yeah, and I found one of your videos really fascinating. It's in a real arid area, not unlike what you find in a lot of the whole Wayne County area. So I know quite a bit about Wayne County, spent a time there. It's a very dry area. It's very cheap for land there. It's not inhabited with many people. But what I want to ask you about is, could this really arid desert landscape be converted to much higher value property just by simply introducing beavers and understanding more of the topography and where drainage ditches have been going and where they were? I want to talk about that in just 1 second. I first need to tell you about another commercial, or another one of our awesome sponsors. The Utah Story Show is also brought to you by Canyon Meadows grass-fed beef. If you haven't tried pasture-raised beef, you really need to go try Canyon Meadows. Their ranch is located in eastern Utah in beautiful Altamont. And speaking of beautiful pastures, they have been working on their pastures for the last 40 years, and they are some of the tallest, most rich, high flourishing pastures I've ever seen in Utah. And it's because they practice regenerative agriculture, and they graze their animals, and then they move their animals, and they let the grass rest long enough so that it grows super tall and high, and it's regenerates the agriculture, regenerates the land and the soil. But best of all is they produce amazing beef. Their ground beef roasts and steaks are amazing. They have pickup locations throughout Salt Lake City. Go visit them right now at cmrbeef.com, and they have special offer for Utah Stories podcast listeners. You're going to get an awesome deal on some steaks and some ground beef. We eat it all the time. It's good for the earth, it's good for you, and it has delicious flavor. Go visit them now at cmrbeef.com. So related to what we were discussing, you look at big, vast expanses of land in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, all over the West where it's basically desert. Could this land be restored through proper management of how groundwater is stored, and by doing basically your techniques of restoring wetlands?
Yes. I'd like to tell a story about my working with the people in Nevada on many of these projects. I've been working on the Wine Cup and Gamble Ranch. It's over 1 million acre ranch in Nevada near Elko. And what we've been doing there is that we've been working to restore a diversity of wetlands for livestock and for wildlife. And we're finding that the both uses are quite compatible. And here's something when you go to the Wine Cup Gamble Ranch, really everything looks brown. Everything on the landscape is dry, except for the valley. And in the valley, you have these uncommon wet meadows that have been there for many, many years. And that's where the cows are, because in the wet meadow, the cows find this highly nutritious sedges and rushes and grasses that are well watered with groundwater. In fact, they've done some measurements on the Wine Cup and Gamble Ranch in Nevada, and they found that when the livestock are in the sagebrush, they're lucky to find 300 pounds per acre of forage. But when they're in a wet meadow, they're foraging on over 1,500 pounds of forage per acre in these wet meadows.
Wow.
So
Say that again.
The comparison is like from 300 pounds per acre of forage to 1,500 pounds with a wet meadow.
Wow. That's some
So on the
huge
Wine Cup
difference.
Gamble Ranch, we are restoring wet meadows and shallow water wetlands to help livestock and to help wildlife. Now, where the streams are flowing year round, we're taking action to encourage beaver to build their dams. When the beaver build their dams, what they do is that they delay that runoff of water in the spring, and much of it will soak into the ground and supply wet meadows with water. And the open water will be great for ducks and geese and herons and sandhill cranes. But what we find is that most of the wet meadows were drained with ditches that were dug using government programs in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So we're going into these ditches and we're disabling them and recontouring the landscape, and we're bringing that groundwater to the surface, and we're restoring these wet meadows. We're taking irrigation ditches that are no longer being used, and we're restoring wet meadows, and the response is phenomenal. The soils are saturated. We don't have to do any seeding. The sedges and the rushes come in, and you have this lush green landscape that's good for cattle and it's good for wildlife. So I've been working a little over 4 years now on the Wine Cup Gamble Ranch. I'm also working in Arizona and helping the U.S. Forest Service to restore wetlands and wet meadows. We're working to help a rare frog called the Chiricahua leopard frog, but we're also working to help ranchers. So when we go in and we restore a wetland or build a wetland, number one, we want to help that rancher have water for the livestock. Number two, we want good forage for wildlife and for livestock. Now,
so certainly there's a huge economical benefit for any rancher if you're getting 4 times the amount of forage per acre. So more and more ranchers are beginning to see that and say, oh, well, because they obviously water's a valuable commodity and those ditches are probably considered very valuable. But if you're quadrupling the amount of forage, obviously that's got to be a better economic benefit than irrigating that water and spraying it over via sprinkling systems.
So the way to view a wetland, it's like a sponge. When you have that spring runoff, it captures that water, it holds it on your land, and it allows it to grow in abundance and diversity of plants for livestock and wildlife. But a ditch is like cutting and ripping that sponge down the middle. The sponge won't saturate anymore. It'll just dry. So many of these ditches that were dug, they have now been deepened from these head cuts and erosion, and they really are hurting the production of all this forage. So what the techniques that I've worked to develop over the last 40 years are low cost and highly effective. And it's all about doing these projects so they require little, if any, maintenance. I've written 4 books documenting these techniques that are available. If you go to my website, it is Wetland Restoration and Training.com. You'll see the books that are listed. And also there are a lot of free materials on that website. I also am involved in teaching hands-on workshops where we will build wetlands. And that's what we did at the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch in 2018. We taught a 3-day workshop where ranchers in the community came in to learn how they could build wetlands on their property for wildlife and livestock that would require little, if any, maintenance. And these folks got involved in the project. They were out there with rakes and shovels. They helped us with planting native species. They learned about the regulations that are around water and water rights. They talked to Brandy and Ron about why they were doing this.
Yeah.
I mean, many people say, well, I don't know why that tank doesn't hold water. Well, these techniques that we've developed for wetland restoration can be used to rebuild and repair a tank or a pond that doesn't hold water and thereby help livestock and wildlife.
Yeah, and you almost can't believe it until you see it. And it seems like there's a lot. It seems like you've got a difficult challenge on your hands, convincing a lot of ranchers that this is the better method. Because I go outside of the Boulder area, and you look at more of the towns and cities in Wayne County, and it's like I see where the irrigation ditches are, and you can see like the water running through valleys, but it's almost like a scar on the landscape. There's no bulrushes, there's no wildlife around. It's just water going through a chasm. And that seems to be way more common than what you're talking about. So is it a big educational effort that you're undergoing now to try to convince more people that this is really a more effective to manage, wildlands and the lands that we have in the West that are really not very valuable?
It is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. When I visit most ranches in the West, I find that the majority of the runoff is leaving that ranch in a hurry, and it's not being used by the rancher. And this is because of the system of ditches and diversions and the erosion that's taken place. And the activities that I work on are to hold that water on the rancher's property and provide it for many of the wildlife species and animals that the rancher is grazing. Mm-hmm. So it can be done, and it's not that expensive. So where can you build a wetland? I've talked about where there's ditches. Another thing to look for is if you've ever been stuck on your ranch, more than likely we could build a wetland at that location. If you've ever seen a patch of sedges, bright green in the winter, more than likely there's water in the ground. And what we could do there is to restore or to develop an open water feature for wildlife and livestock. If you're walking a ditch and you maybe see a patch of sedges or water seeping into the side of the ditch, then that indicates that ditch is grabbing water from a spring. And we could restore the flow from that spring and get that water to soak into the ground. So what we're doing is
let me understand correctly. What you're talking about, sedges. What is that exactly?
Sedge is a bright green plant that has sharp edges. If you go to touch it, you'll feel, oh, that's not real soft. And they grow in areas where the soil is wet. And if you find sedges growing, more than likely there's water in the ground, and we could develop a wetland at the location.
Okay, so it's like a hard, grassy plant.
So if you search on the internet and just look up sedges, you can learn how to identify sedges. There's a saying that we have: sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have nodes that go to the ground. So if you pick a grass, you'll see joints in it or nodes. But if you pick a sedge, it will be entire. It won't have nodes in it. And bulrushes are round, and all bulrushes and sedges grow on saturated ground, and we want to see more of those for the reasons we've talked about. So what you can also do is look at an aerial photo off the web of your ranch, and you can see ditches on an aerial photograph, and oftentimes you can see these bright patches of sedges. And these are areas where you may want to consider restoring them if you find evidence that they've been changed.
So,
So go ahead, please. Yeah.
related to what you're talking about, so any rancher in the West, if they want to use your services, are there limitations to what ranches will be able to and which ones won't? Because, for example, I went really far north once and met some ranchers who are up in the promontory area, really close to the Great Salt Lake, where the soil is really acidic, and they need something like 1 acre for every 10 sheep they graze. Are there limitations in places like that where you could make a difference?
I've been able to find places to build wetlands everywhere. I mean, no matter how arid the landscape, no matter how eroded, you can generally find a place to build a wetland at not a very high cost. And I enjoy traveling and helping ranchers. I keep my prices low. I provide much volunteer help to people. I'm going to many states every year. We're working major projects now in Idaho and Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico and California. And I always welcome people to come out and see what we're doing. Every day, well, I build wetlands almost every day. And without a doubt, I learn about techniques every day. And what I find is that many of the techniques that people have used are traditional and not very effective. People used to build dams across drainages that had a huge catchment or watershed. And when that odd rain came, everything washed out. We don't need to do that anymore. We have techniques now where we can hold that runoff and not have it leave the ranch. We have techniques now where we can go into the groundwater and not have to worry about damage during a flood. So these techniques you'll find in my latest book, Wetland Restoration and Construction, a technical guide. And also you'll find many of these written up on my website that they may want to look at. And also they can send me an email. My email is tombiebighauser@gmail.com. And every day I provide help to people who are interested in building wetland areas. It's something, most of our wetlands were drained by people who did not have help from the government. And if we agree that building wetlands is a good thing, if we're going to try to bring back many of these wetlands, we're going to have to do it. The private landowner is going to have to do it without government help. Because the days of lots of money to help private landowners are gone. And folks are finding that their priorities are, we want to keep water on our landscape, and maybe instead of going somewhere for a vacation, maybe the vacation can be building a wetland on their property. And I work with many people who have set these priorities and say, I'd rather be able to walk out my back door and see wildlife and water than I would to take a trip somewhere. So
Absolutely.
Those are strange people, I know, but there's a lot of us, and it's what we like to do.
Yeah, and I want to go into an area in Utah where we're about to remove some wetlands and why that might be a bad idea, in your opinion. So I want to talk about the inland port. That's been a huge issue, both on this program and in Salt Lake. But before I get to that, I want to tell you about our last sponsor today. It's the Carpet Barn. If you need new carpet and you want to get a better deal on high quality carpet than what you can get at big box stores, go check out the Carpet Barn. They've been in business for over 40 years. Their staff is friendly and helpful, and they have a massive 25,000 square foot warehouse full of carpet where they've basically bought the overstock and stuff that has some slight little defect. And you can get carpet that's typically $12 to $15 a square foot for closer to $6 to $8 a square foot. I carpeted my basement. It's just super plush, awesome carpet. And it's way superior to the carpet that I paid $12 a square yard for 10 years earlier. So go check out the Carpet Barn. They're in South Salt Lake. Mention you found them on the Utah Stories podcast. That would help us out. Big topic, big controversial topic is We have 16,000 acres of unused land on the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake in the city proper, and developers are salivating over this land because it's empty. It borders the Great Salt Lake. A lot of it's already been backhoed and plowed, and the wetlands have been moved off to the side. But the problem is it's within a rock's throw of the largest bird migratory area west of the Mississippi, the shores of the Great Salt Lake. I know you don't live here locally in Utah, but what do you think about the plan to just build a giant inland port around the shores of the Great Salt Lake?
People have been draining wetland areas since the 1700s in the United States. When you go into the eastern U.S., you find very few wetlands remaining because of drainage. And we know that this has continued throughout the West and Southwest. And there are many, many reasons why people drain wetlands. Number one was to create farmland or hay ground for ranching. And also people would drain wetlands to build their homes.
Yeah, it makes sense. You don't want a swamp around your house. You don't want to step out and fall into a swamp.
I grew up in Minnesota, and I found out that our home was built on a wetland because in the spring when it would rain, salamanders would drop into our window wells. And also we had a sump pump. So people have been building on wetlands for many, many years. Now, there are a number of regulations or laws that were set up by Congress and the president to guide the drainage and to regulate the drainage of wetlands. And these are all around placing fill in wetland areas. And these wetlands have to be looked at to see if they are jurisdictional wetlands, which means whether or not they are regulated wetlands. And in order to drain or fill a wetland, more than likely permits will be needed. And the permits will be needed from various government agencies, federal and state. And it's a process that's very well done that folks go through to apply for the permit so they can place fill in a wetland area. And this has been in place for many, many years. And the different people with the government agencies know all about these programs and work with folks. And this is really quite a regulated process. And oftentimes, if the fill in the wetland is approved, then compensatory mitigation will be required, or the developer will be required to actually restore more wetlands that are being damaged. Now, each wetland is unique. It's like saying, what do you like better, your right hand or your left hand? Well, actually, I like them both. I want to lose either one. In the same way, each wetland is unique. Now, when I fly in to Salt Lake City, I marvel at the complex of natural wetlands that are still remaining. But I'm also dismayed at the abundance of ditches and canals and ghosts of drained wetlands I see from the air. So many of the wetlands around the Great Salt Lake have been impacted and have been destroyed. So this is something that the people of Utah really, I'm sure, are all looking at and looking at their priorities and saying, what's the most important thing here? Now, what I work with most are ranchers who are interested in building wetlands because it's a good thing to do, not because they have to do it. And we can do this at quite a low cost. Now, if you are required to mitigate for wetland loss, it can be quite expensive. I've heard figures of a minimum of $60,000 an acre to mitigate.
Yeah, and I want to ask you just one quick question because we're almost out of time. So the economic impact, I think, that a lot of these developers look at is the land is way more valuable if it's developed and if it's made into an inland port. But the reason why people want to live along the Wasatch Front, the reason why people are attracted to places like the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch is that you have all of these species coming and enjoying the wetland, and you have far more diversity of wildlife. You have I think you have a better quality of life when you're closer to wildlife. So they're basically looking at the opportunity cost, and they're deciding that the opportunity cost of restoring that wetland and allowing the birds to stay there and to not develop the area is much lower than the opportunity of development. Is that often a factor that ranchers and that developers are looking at?
Well, we can list the many values of wetlands: flood control, groundwater recharge, wildlife habitat, fish habitat, and they're beautiful to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And many people want wetlands on their property, or they want to build wetlands on their property. So these are all really important values of wetlands. And I just encourage people that if you know where a wetland's located, yes, please work to protect it. If you know where a wetland used to be or think it used to be there, yes, please work to restore it. It's a good thing to do. I've worked with biologists who have 35 years in their career, and we build one wetland together, and they tell me it's the best project they've ever done in their life. I work with private landowners who have never built a wetland, and after we build that one wetland, they send photos to me, they send updates, they're so excited. They say, I wish I would have done this years ago. So
Well, I talked to the executive director of the Inland Port Community Board just a couple weeks ago. He was on our show. I'm going to recommend he calls you and that they consider restoring the wetland habitat that where they're considering building this, because it's just a stupid idea. I mean, we obviously need shipping and receiving, but why build it on the shores of the biggest bird migratory area west of the Mississippi? It's just, you can move it someplace else where it doesn't have to have such a massive impact on the ecology, the wildlife, and the potential beauty that area could have. So I'll definitely recommend he reach out to you.
Look forward to our discussion.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Tom, for being on the program. I really appreciate touching base and hearing what you've done with the Boulder Mountain Guest Ranch, and hopefully we can have more people who were involved at that ranch on the show. It's just an incredible place. I recommend anybody watching. A lot of people go to Boulder and Escalante to go backpacking. That's how I knew that area, but you got to stop at the Guest Ranch. Sweetwater Kitchen. My friend Eric is a gourmet chef. He's an amazing guy, and they've made this an incredible ranch. You got to go out and eat the food and stay overnight. So, with that, thanks a lot, Tom. I really appreciate you being on.
I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
All right. Okay, and just a little bit about what's been going on behind the scenes here at Utah Stories. We are about to come out with our August issue of the magazine. It's taken us a while. Obviously, we have a food-driven magazine. This was our issue a couple years ago of the food issue. We have dozens of restaurants advertising with us due to COVID. A lot of those restaurants had to pull out. We had to just, of course, let them out of their advertising contracts. But we've managed to scrape together enough advertisers to put together our August issue. It's our Hidden Utah issue. And I think it's fantastic. It's just super cool. We've got stories about gambling operations on the sly. We've got ghost town stories. We've got stories about whitewater rafting in Moab. We got a great story by Dan Potts about the inland port. Definitely consider subscribing to Utah Stories. There's probably not been a better time to do it in terms of actually helping our writers, keeping the content flow coming. What I notice is as we've been getting dry with funds for the magazine and just been producing podcasts, we don't have as many intriguing topics to be covering. It's like the topics line themselves up with the writers. And we love, having our regular contributors of the magazine. So consider going to utahstories.com, subscribing to the magazine. It's $30 a month. We'll send it right to your door every single month. And you could really help us out that way. And of course, you can also help us out by just visiting the sponsors, the awesome sponsors who've been a part of this program throughout COVID. And yeah, they've been super helpful. ActionToyRentals.com, CMRBeef.com, and the Carpet Barn. For this episode, we're about to pick up another sponsor, and if you know a small business in Utah that would be interested in connecting with influential decision makers throughout Utah, have them check out utahstories.com/advertising and get in contact with us. So with that, thanks for watching the program. Our technical producer is Tyler Bond, our booking manager is Connie Lewis, and our digital publisher is Golda Hukic Markosian. Thank you to all of them for making this show possible, and I'll see you next time.